Laba diena. Malonu būti Vilniuje. Ačiū už kvietimą. This is my third visit to Lithuania. My first was in June 1990 when I snuck into the country without a visa. And I hope we have time during the coffee afterwards, and I'll tell you about that exciting story. It was for me. For the last 38 years, I have lived and worked in a very exciting and entrepreneurial place, namely Silicon Valley in San Francisco, Bay Area of California. Silicon Valley is home to Apple, Google, Facebook, HP, Intel, Genentech, Salesforce, Twitter, Yelp, and many others. In these last 38 years, I've worked for large and small companies alike, some of which have gone out of business, and founded, grown, and sold 2 software companies of my own. My book, Unleash Your Inner Company, which you can see over there, is a distillation of what I've learned over the last 30 years. And I understand we're going to be giving away a copy to somebody before the end of the session. What can Silicon Valley tell us about entrepreneurship, and how can we create Silicon Valleys in Lithuania and Europe? Well, first to understand is that Silicon Valley has arisen organically over 8 decades. Silicon Valley was not designed nor planned, nor could it have been. No one could predict that thousands of mobile app developers would arise for mobile devices, which in turn would arise from cell phones and devices like the Palm Pilot, which would evolve alongside the World Wide Web, laptops and pagers, and which would arise in parallel with gene sequencing and so on. All of the seeds and soil that gave rise to mobile apps and all of these innovations existed in the 1980s or before, yet no one predicted or could have predicted them. Even as late as 2003, no one predicted or could have predicted the incredible rise of Facebook, which was founded in 2004. Unpredictability is not specific to Silicon Valley. It is a feature of all innovation. In the Santa Fe Institute in Santa Fe, New Mexico, is a world-leading research center that focuses on complex systems. Economies, the environment, the human brain, innovation, and common law are all examples of complex systems, meaning that order arises not by top-down design, but from the interactions of many agents, whether individuals, neurons, or companies. Negligible differences in initial conditions can give rise to large differences in outcomes. And if you try to control such systems, you get unintended consequences. So don't try to predict them, and don't try to control them. Culture is one element critical to Silicon Valley's success. Silicon Valley and Route 128, the U.S. has 2 top high-tech companies, or regions, Silicon Valley and Route 128 surrounding Boston. In the 1980s, Silicon Valley overtook Route 128, despite the fact that Route 128 got started decades earlier. Why? Well, one factor is that Boston had a tradition of lifetime employment that discouraged job hopping and thus limited the spread and recombination of skills and knowledge. Route 128 was mainly populated by vertically integrated centralized companies like Honeywell, Digital, Wang, and Prime, computer companies that made everything from disk drives to CPUs. In contrast, in Silicon Valley, job hopping and new company formation was very acceptable and common. Silicon Valley had many separate companies making disk drives and CPUs and terminals and disk controllers. So the competition in spontaneous order was more direct, more granular, and more intense. Boston's computer industry has long disappeared. Those centralized companies could not adapt when technology shifted from mainframes to minis to desktops to laptops to mobile devices. In contrast, Silicon Valley's more decentralized ecosystem was more resilient and could more readily adapt as market conditions change. Most of the hundreds of companies started in Silicon Valley over the decades have failed. Growth comes from the companies that survive and grow, and these are a small minority of all of the companies that are founded. It's not enough to have a few well-established anchor companies to have a robust ecosystem. You need thousands of companies starting up, most of which will fail, and a few of which will succeed and grow larger. So we've seen that, one, you cannot predict winners in advance, and two, you need a lot of startups, most of which will fail. So don't expect an arm of the Lithuania or EU government, in particular, to choose winners and losers and to create the Silicon Valley. Even highly rewarded and experienced venture capitalists get only 1 or 2 investments out of 10 right. Especially with the political forces that lead them astray, governments cannot choose winners and losers. A notable example is Solyndra, the solar energy company in Silicon Valley. Before Solyndra declared bankruptcy in 2011, the U.S. Department of Energy and State of California together provided over $500 million of loans, none of which were recovered. You don't want to subject Lithuania and EU taxpayers to that kind of Russian roulette. Governments cannot even predict winning or losing technologies, much less specific products and services. As I wrote in Forbes 3 years ago, in 2010, the U.S. Joint Forces Command warned that, quote, by 2012, surplus oil production capacity could entirely disappear, quote. Somehow they missed the fracking revolution, which would hugely expand U.S. oil and gas production just 2 years later. In 2011, the Federal Communications Commission and AT&T saw a looming crisis. Wireless was running out of spectrum. Somehow they missed out on Wi-Fi, which would bypass and preserve the precious wireless spectrum, completely eliminating the crisis. So don't expect governments to choose winners and losers. It's hard enough for individual investors to do it. So regarding successes, everybody has heard of the huge IPOs like Google and Facebook, but realize that for every very visible success like that are many much smaller successes that might benefit just a few founders or co-founders, and that spreads wealth very broadly across the region. The Silicon Valley is the ultimate anti-poverty program. Those events have further given rise to major capital, large and small, all of which help launch the next cohort of startups which complete the positive feedback loop. So these factors have contributed to Silicon Valley's success. The biggest obstacle to its success, in my view, has been regulation. In most respects, technology has made starting new businesses and entrepreneurship easier, but one thing has made it harder, and that's regulation. Let me give you one simple example. Over half of U.S. states now require a license to braid hair. In some cases, braiders, many of them black young women who can ill afford the expense, must take irrelevant courses costing thousands of dollars. So you can see how many potential entrepreneurs, especially those with few skills and resources, are being blocked by regulation. Let's see the effect of imposed regulations graphically. Here you see how each year a greater and greater number of, or each decade a greater and greater number of entrepreneurs are blocked from starting their own businesses by regulations that don't improve quality of life, but rather generate revenues for governments and protect politically important lobbies from competition. Say that 10 years ago, in some aspect of your life, perhaps your health or the airspace above or around your home, what you were allowed to do was limited by regulation. Now fast forward 10 years to the present. Regulations stay fixed while advances in knowledge and technology and cooperation have enabled many more dimensions of human needs to be satisfied. What had previously been a single dimension of possibilities is now many dimensions that are precluded. But the situation is much worse than that because the regulations are not clear, flat boundaries, but complex surfaces. And the more longer and complex and subjective the regulations are, the more time and money it costs to explore these surfaces, advantaging the well-funded and well-connected and influential. Over 100,000 health and fitness apps compete on mobile devices today, but they're relatively few in pharmaceuticals, aviation, construction, and other areas. Why? Because those areas are more heavily regulated. If even a fraction of the startups in mobile devices and health and fitness could shift to the other areas, humanity would see much better and faster advances. So what can Lithuania and Europe do? Well, there's the easy and popular approach, which are government-sponsored tax incentives and business plan competitions, and elevator pitch competitions. I call these entrepreneurship theater. We are creating an entire generation of entrepreneurs, aspiring entrepreneurs, who know how to write business plans and give elevator pitches and win free trips to Brussels, but who have never even tried to engage a customer or get a business off the ground. So what would be more effective? Well, we need to start putting in place the right climate and environment today. As we've seen, an ecosystem is like a rainforest, and so we need to focus on climate and environment. First, adopt tax codes that enable entrepreneurs to keep more of their gains in Lithuania than anywhere else. If we're really effective, we won't merely enable Lithuanian entrepreneurs, we will attract entrepreneurs from across the EU and the world to Lithuania. Second, make regulations as light as possible. It's really hard because, as I explained in the book, the regulation that's most onerous varies from industry and region to region. Here are some of the many techniques that I discuss in the book that make it easier to launch, to innovate, and to expand companies. In the book, I share the story of a 9-year-old boy in Kansas who successfully overturned an oppressive regulation in his neighborhood. So if a 9-year-old boy can do it, you can do it. We forget that markets are already organically regulated by such laws as supply and demand, word of mouth, and common laws that have evolved over centuries. These forms of regulation are healthy, necessary, and inescapable. When we impose top-down regulations on top of these organic regulations, we create uncertainty and cost and invite crony capitalism and corruption. And a very useful metric is the World Bank Ease of Doing Business Index. Lithuania currently ranks 20, up from 21 last year. That's good. That's an improvement. Here's something very measurable and tangible. Make it a goal to have HALVE, Lithuania's rank, by in the next 5 years. So if we're currently at 20, make it a goal to be at 10 5 years from now. That's a goal that all of us can rally around. These are all the components that make up that overall index. We can work on them one-on-one individually. In summary, to create Silicon Valleys in Lithuania and Europe, recognize that they cannot be designed, that the winners and losers cannot be predicted, especially by governments. Focus instead on creating the right climate and environment, attractive taxes and unobtrusive regulation. Trust in freedom and free markets. Nothing less than freedom and the continuing flourishing of Lithuania and EU are at stake. Thank you.